In this video, we're going to be breaking down the most racist episodes of Family Guy. Let's get started. When Family Guy turned Indigenous people into a walking stereotype, Chris Griffin runs away to join the Peace Corps in South America to escape high school bullying, but what starts as a story about teenage problems quickly becomes a masterclass in how not to portray Indigenous cultures on television. Chris starts high school absolutely terrified about something called the freshman hunt, where seniors supposedly beat up new students with paddles. His family reassures him that this is just a myth to scare freshmen, but naturally it turns out to be completely real when Chris gets immediately chased down and beaten on his first day. Meanwhile, Peter's dealing with his own problems after losing his job and eventually landing work at the Pawtucket Brewery, where his drinking gets him demoted to working under a mentally disabled supervisor named Opie. When Chris comes home devastated about school, Brian tries to help by sharing his own experience running away to the Peace Corps. Brian casually mentions that he and other volunteers got so high they ate all the food that the World Health Organization had airlifted in for starving villagers, then adds, "Those villagers were so pissed. They tried to chase us, but let me just say, thank God for polio." Brian tells this story like it's just a funny college memory, rather than admitting he literally stole food from dying people and then mocked their disabilities. Chris decides to follow Brian's example and actually runs away to join the Peace Corps. The pilot flying Chris to South America tells him, "By the way, the word colored still flies down there, so get your fill." The show has a character encouraging a teenager to use racial slurs because supposedly nobody will care in South America. Earlier in the episode, there's also a reference to Howard Stern making a joke about a Negro that was apparently okay because Robin Quivers laughed along. Even for Family Guy's standards of pushing boundaries, these references feel particularly casual and throwaway. When Chris arrives at his assigned village, he meets Chief Oleki, who welcomes him by saying, "Our air is clean, our food is bountiful, and our water is caffeine-free. Never had it? Never will." Chief Oleki then introduces his daughter Loca, his son Hidalgo, and somehow his cousin Vinny, who immediately says, "Hey, how you doing? Give me a word, any word at all, and I'll pronounce it funny for a nickel." The villagers are portrayed as simple people who speak in broken English and are easily amazed by basic modern concepts. The inclusion of Cousin Vinny seems like the show's attempt at absurd humor, the joke being that even in the middle of the Amazon, you can't escape stereotypical Italian-American characters. During a harvest festival, Chris joins in a traditional dance that accidentally gets him married to Loca according to tribal customs. Chief Oleki announces, "This is a joyous occasion. You've engaged the entire tribe in dance. According to our customs, you're now married to my daughter." Chris responds, "I couldn't be happier," until he realizes what just happened and asks, "What?" The episode treats these marriage customs like they're just quirky, exotic traditions rather than legitimate cultural practices. When the family calls to check on Chris, Peter immediately asks, "How's the food in South America? Do the women there have exposed clitorati?" Peter's first instinct upon hearing his son is in another country is to make crude sexual comments about the local women. This is classic Peter Griffin behavior, URT, inappropriate and self-centered, but it also sets the tone for how the episode views South American culture. When Peter and Lois fly down to retrieve Chris, Peter discovers that his small amount of American money makes him incredibly wealthy by local standards. The villagers stare in amazement, and one says, "We've never seen that much money before. You are richest man in the country." Instead of showing any humility about this economic disparity, Peter immediately starts exploiting his newfound power for entertainment. Peter begins paying the villagers to perform degrading tasks for his amusement. He gets them to reenact episodes of Seinfeld, forcing the village's high priestess to play Elaine and ask, "Can you spare one square?" He also pays someone he calls Pesci to say Yugoslavia in a funny voice, then gives someone else money and says, "Here's a dime. Kill Pesci." Peter even commissions what looks like a nature documentary, where he describes the villagers as having sinewy, muscular form and unusual vitality, like he's observing animals at a zoo. The most revealing moment comes when Peter explicitly states, "Finally, a white man has an opportunity to be rich and in charge." The episode literally acknowledges the colonial power dynamics at play while treating them as comedy. Peter's whole setup treats Indigenous people like they exist solely for white characters' amusement and exploitation. Eventually, Chris realizes what's happening and tells his father, "Dad, I've had enough of you taking advantage of these people. For God's sake, the woman playing Elaine is a high priestess." Lois also points out that both Chris and Peter are using these people to escape their real problems. Chris admits, "I married this one-year-old girl for all the wrong reasons," and apologizes to Loka, saying he only came there because he was afraid of being a freshman. The episode ends with the family having to flee when the community finally turns against them. Family Guy has always built its reputation on satirical boundary-pushing humor that's designed to shock and provoke rather than promote genuine harm. The show's trademark approach is to take sensitive topics and push them to absurd extremes for comedic effect. However, in this episode, we see how that satirical approach can cross significant lines, particularly when dealing with real cultures and communities. While the intent may be satirical comedy through shock value, the execution still lands in deeply problematic territory. The portrayal of Indigenous people as primitive, easily exploited, and existing mainly for entertainment feels less like clever satire and more like lazy stereotyping. Even when you account for Family Guy's irreverent style and Peter's character as an ignorant buffoon, the episode's approach to Indigenous culture goes beyond satirical commentary into territory that feels genuinely harmful. The show's typical defense of equal opportunity offense doesn't quite hold up when the humor relies so heavily on one-dimensional portrayals of real communities that continue to face discrimination and marginalization today. If you're sensitive to 911 jokes, brace yourself, because this next episode holds nothing back. Road to the Multiverse, when Family Guy turned 9/11 paranoia into comedy gold. Peter Griffin converts to Islam after meeting a Muslim man in the hospital, but what starts as Peter's typical impulsive cultural appropriation quickly spirals into a terrorist plot that plays on every post-9 divided by 11 joke imaginable. In this episode, Family Guy dove headfirst into the most sensitive topic of the era with their trademark lack of subtlety. Peter, Joe, and Quagmire decide they need to shake up their boring suburban lives after realizing they've become pathetically dull middle-aged men. Peter suggests they either rob a mafia poker game or go skydiving. Naturally, they choose the safer option of jumping out of planes. Peter becomes completely obsessed with skydiving, doing it constantly around the neighborhood and destroying property in the process. During one particularly bad landing, he ends up in the hospital where he meets Mahmoud, a Muslim man who's also a patient. Peter immediately bonds with Mahmoud over watching Muslim Looney Tunes, where Porky Pig declares, "As a pig, I am very dirty and should not be touched by humans." When Peter brings Mahmoud to meet his friends at the Clam, the guys are immediately uncomfortable. Quagmire asks which Spanish chick has better jugs, and when Mahmoud politely declines to answer because he's married, they all get suspicious. Joe questions why he ordered a ginger ale instead of alcohol, and they mock his cell phone clipped to his belt. The episode sets up the classic Family Guy dynamic, where Peter's friends represent typical American prejudices, while Peter remains obliviously accepting. Peter starts spending more time with Mahmoud, visiting Middle Eastern restaurants, and learning about Islamic culture. This is where the episode starts leaning heavily into stereotypes. Mahmoud takes Peter to a restaurant filled with ear-bloodening sounds and nose-bloodening smells, where they serve chicken that has been yelled at for 2 hours and then run over by a Mercedes. Peter tries a hookah and says it's like smoking my grandfather's jacket. But the moment that really hooks Peter into converting comes when Mahmoud casually mentions that in Muslim culture, wives are much more obedient, and demonstrates by having his wife run errands for Peter without question. Peter immediately declares, "You, sir, have got yourself a Muslim," and converts to Islam primarily because he wants an obedient wife. He starts wearing traditional clothing and learning customs like ululation, which the episode presents as terrifying noise-making. When Lois asks him to pick up groceries from the market, Peter insists on calling it the bazaar and returns with 6 cobras, a bolt of silk, and a ram's horn, instead of bread and butter. The joke here is that Muslims apparently can't function in normal American society. The episode takes its most problematic turn when Mahmoud invites Peter to a secret meeting with his friends. The other Muslims immediately test Peter's loyalty by asking, who is better, Hulk Hogan, or the Iron Sheik? When Peter correctly answers the Iron Sheik, they welcome him into their group. Then they casually announce they're planning to blow up the Quahog Bridge using a van full of explosives. Peter's friends realize he's stumbled into a terrorist sleeper cell and convince him to go undercover wearing a wire to gather intelligence. During the terrorist meeting, the leader announces that Peter will drive the bomb van because we will need an American behind the wheel to arouse the least amount of suspicion. But when Peter accidentally mentions his microphone, they discover the wire and force him to drive the van immediately. As they approach the bridge, Peter delivers a rambling speech about American values, mentioning everything from Jenny McCarthy's vaccine opinions to black women fighting at IHOP, trying to convince Mahmoud not to go through with the attack. The episode ends with police arresting all the terrorists after Joe and his team follow the van. When Peter asks what happens next to the arrested men, Joe gives a vague non-answer about the process and suggests they all go get drinks. Peter then makes what appears to be a phone call using Arabic numbers, causing his friends to panic and flee. The implication is that Peter might still be connected to terrorist activities, leaving the ending deliberately ambiguous about whether he's learned anything from the experience. What's striking about this episode is how it managed to turn genuine post-9 divided by 11 anxieties into comedal while somehow making Peter the most reasonable character in the room. The fact that his conversion to Islam was motivated entirely by wanting a more obedient wife says everything about how the show viewed both Peter's character and the culture he was appropriating. Family Guy's willingness to tackle such loaded subject matter head-on definitely marked this as one of their most controversial episodes, but it certainly wasn't going to be their last venture into racially charged territory. Up next, we're diving into another episode about dating black girls. Baby Got Black, S12, E18, when Family Guy tackled interracial dating and made everyone uncomfortable. Chris Griffin starts dating Jerome's daughter Pam, creating an interracial relationship that exposes every racial anxiety Family Guy could pack into one episode. What begins as a sweet teenage romance quickly becomes a battlefield of racial tensions that somehow makes both sides look equally ridiculous. The episode starts innocently enough with Peter, Joe, and Quagmire having a contest to see who can stay awake the longest after hearing about a kid who died playing video games for 51 hours straight. They bet $100 each on who can last longest, leading to typical Family Guy hijinks with hallucinations and falling asleep standing up. Peter wins the contest and uses his $200 winnings to take the family out to dinner, where Chris introduces them to his new girlfriend Pam, who happens to be Jerome's daughter. Peter's immediate reaction is telling, not instead of being concerned about the interracial aspect, he's shocked that Chris managed to find a girlfriend who isn't fat. Peter literally says, "Chris, she's not fat," and admits he expected they'd have to back her through the garage. When Chris asks if Peter minds that Pam is black, Peter declares Peter Griffin does not see color and mentions that it's 1,998, as if that magically solved racism. Meanwhile, Lois starts listing every black person she's ever seen on television, including that monster that plays tennis, presumably referring to Serena Williams. Jerome's reaction is much more direct and problematic. He immediately tells Peter nobody's dating nobody, and when Peter calls him racist, Jerome responds, "Black people can't be racist. We can be way sexist, but we ain't racist." This leads to Peter making increasingly tone-deaf comments, including suggesting that white people are even better than black people, before correcting himself to separate but equal, literally invoking segregation-era language. When Jerome and Pam come to dinner at the Griffin house, the conversation becomes a minefield of racial awkwardness. Lois talks about people of color breaking bread at their table, using language that sounds patronizing. When Jerome interprets her compliments about his parenting as surprise that a single black man could raise a child properly, the dinner spirals into confrontation. Jerome accuses white guys of only wanting black women as a notch on their belt, and calls Pam a novelty to white people. This triggers Peter's most problematic moment, a full musical number called Thank the Whites, where he lists everything white people have supposedly given to black culture. Peter sings about giving black people Eminem and Justin Bieber too, even though they dress and try to talk like you, along with Taylor Swift, J. Crew clothing, and leggy blondes with tiny asses. The song's entire premise is that black people should be grateful to white people for cultural contributions, which manages to be both historically ignorant and incredibly condescending. Jerome's response is perfect. That song only made me hate white people even more. After the disastrous dinner, Chris and Pam run away together to a motel, leading to Peter and Jerome having to work together to find them. During their search, they get pulled over by police, and Jerome explains how he gets stopped for made-up violations all the time, despite being a law-abiding business owner. Jerome tells Peter, "You don't know what it's like to be treated like a criminal," and describes the anger that comes from dealing with constant racial profiling. Peter's response is to suggest Jerome should handle anger like he does, with footloose dancing. When they find Chris and Pam at the motel before anything happens, Jerome explains his protective stance by saying, "White people have exploited and mistreated blacks for centuries, and I'm not going to let that happen to Pam." Peter initially seems to understand, but then takes Jerome's concerns to an absurd extreme by telling Chris he can't talk to any black people anymore to keep the races completely separate. Chris points out the obvious flaw by asking, "How the hell am I supposed to get through airport security?" Jerome finally realizes he's been overreacting and agrees to let the kids date, saying, "Maybe I did overreact, and that this generation can teach us a thing or two." The episode ends with Peter making one more inappropriate comment about Jerome having a crazy big hog for admitting when he's wrong. Here, we Family Guy attempting to address real issues like racial profiling and interracial dating anxieties, but the execution often feels like it's playing both sides for laughs, rather than making meaningful commentary. While Jerome's concerns about police harassment are presented seriously, the show also mocks his protective instincts and reduces complex racial dynamics to comedic misunderstandings. The Thank the Whites musical number stands out as particularly tone-deaf, even by Family Guy standards. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this breakdown. And if you thought one episode about racial tensions was enough, wait until you see what happens when the show decides to tackle the issues of colonialism and indigenous tribes. Peter's Progress S7, E16. When Family Guy used colonial history to hide racial content, Peter Griffin learns from a psychic that he was the founder of Quahog in a past life. This leads to a long historical story that puts colonial-era racism into a tale about true love and founding fathers. This time around, Family Guy used old-time settings as an excuse to explore racial themes while hiding behind claims of historical accuracy. The episode starts with Peter, Joe, and Quagmire drinking at the Clam. Cleveland brings his cousin from Jamaica named Madame Claude, who works as a psychic. Quagmire right away tells her, "You sound like the crab from Little Mermaid," then starts talking about having crabs. This sets the tone for how the episode treats Caribbean culture. Madame Claude speaks in a heavy Jamaican accent throughout the whole episode. She offers to tell the guys about their past lives. She tells Joe he was an octopus, which makes him excited because he could have had 8 working limbs. She says Quagmire was Jack the Ripper in Old London. When Peter gets his turn, Madame Claude finds out he was Griffin Peterson, the founder of the city of Quahog. This goes against what they learned in school about Miles Chatterbox Musket founding the town. Peter calls her Cool Runnings to dismiss her, but he gets interested when she starts telling his past life story. The episode then goes into a long historical sequence that takes place in colonial England and early America. The historical parts begin in England, where Griffin Peterson wants to marry Lady Redbush, but King Stewart III exiles him to the New World because the king wants Lady Redbush for himself. During the boat trip to America, Griffin meets other exiles. One guy got caught pleasuring myself to a painstakingly etched engraving of the wife of Bath. Another slept with an underage virgin to cure my puff penis. These crude jokes show that the historical setting will be used mainly for comedy with no serious look at colonial history. Griffin Peterson arrives in the New World and calls the land Quahog. He says they will build a settlement with equal rights for all, but then he immediately starts excluding people. He says, except blacks, Asians, Hispanics, Jews, gays, women, Muslims, everybody who's not a white man, and I mean white, so no Italians, no Polish, just people from Ireland, England, and Scotland, but only certain parts of Scotland and Ireland, just full-blooded whites. No, you know what? Not even whites. Nobody gets any rights. He ends this speech by sighing, "America." The episode shows this exclusion speech as both a joke about American hypocrisy and an accurate view of colonial attitudes. Griffin Peterson builds his settlement and marries a local woman. Lady Redbush finds out he is alive and sails to America on one of the slave ships. The episode casually mentions the slave trade as easy transportation without talking about the human cost involved. King Stuart eventually follows Lady Redbush to America because he wants to take her back and kill Griffin Peterson. When they face off, the conflict gets solved through a talent show. King Stuart does the same comedy routine about Aunt Frida that appeared earlier in the episode. Griffin Peterson and the colonists do a big musical number with electronic music and dancing. The colonists win, which lets Griffin Peterson and Lady Redbush live happily ever after. Through all the historical parts, the episode treats slavery, colonialism, and systematic exclusion as background elements that do not need serious examination. The slave ship reference gets thrown away as a casual plot device. Griffin Peterson's speech about denying rights to almost everyone gets played as a joke about American contradictions rather than meaningful commentary on historical injustice. What stands out about this episode is how it uses the past life story device to distance itself from responsibility for the racial content. Since these are supposedly historical events from centuries ago, the show can include exclusionary attitudes and references to slavery while claiming they are showing period-accurate behavior. The Jamaican psychic character serves as the vehicle for this historical journey, but she gets shown through familiar Caribbean stereotypes rather than as a fully developed character. The episode basically uses time travel as a way to explore racial themes while keeping plausible deniability about promoting those attitudes in the present day. Even with historical context as cover, some boundaries still got crossed in ways that left viewers questioning whether the comedy was worth the cultural cost. Speaking of crossing boundaries, our next episode shows how Family Guy portrays an entire culture using very insensitive stereotypes. Peter's Two Dads S. 5E10. When Family Guy turned Ireland into a drinking stereotype playground, Peter Griffin discovers his real father is Irish and travels to Ireland to meet him, leading to an episode that turns every possible Irish tropes into a crude joke. When Peter went looking for parental acceptance, Family Guy saw an opportunity to depict Ireland as a land filled with nothing but drunks, fighters, and simple folk with thick accents. The episode starts with Peter organizing a terrible birthday party for Meg that includes a drunk hobo clown called Pea Pants, who eats garbage and pulls scarves out of his mouth. During the party, Peter crashes a unicycle and accidentally kills his adoptive father, Francis Griffin. As Francis dies, instead of saying, "I love you," his last words to Peter are, "You're a fat, stinking drunk." This sends Peter into a crisis about his drinking problem and his relationship with his father. After visiting a hypnotherapist, Peter learns that Francis was not his biological father. His mother reveals that Peter's real father is Mickey McFinnigan, an Irishman she met 40 years ago during a vacation. This discovery sets up the episode's main content, ATI, Peter's journey to Ireland to find his real father and prove he belongs with his biological family. When Peter arrives in Ireland, the episode immediately starts piling on Irish stereotypes. The first person he meets gives an over-the-top explanation about McSwiggan Village, where the hills are green, the streams are clear, and the sweaters are so thick, even the boniest-fingered nun could poke you in the chest and it wouldn't bother you none. This character speaks in an exaggerated Irish accent and uses flowery, nonsensical language that makes Irish people sound like they live in a fairy tale. The episode presents Ireland as a place where fighting is a way of life. Peter encounters the McMurphy brothers, who have been circling that same spot for 50 years, just daring each other to throw the first punch. They stand there saying, "Just you try it, and I'd like to see you have at it," without ever actually fighting. This portrays Irish people as all talk and no action, constantly looking for fights but never following through. The most problematic joke comes when Peter asks about Mickey McFinnigan and learns he is the town drunk. When Peter expresses shock that his father would be the disgrace of the whole town, a local character explains, "Around here, the town drunk is a person of great honor." The episode literally presents Irish culture as one where alcoholism gets celebrated and respected rather than treated as a serious problem. Mickey McFinnigan himself represents every Irish drunk stereotype possible. He speaks in an exaggerated accent, makes sexual references to sheep, and immediately assumes Peter wants money from him. When Peter explains he wants a relationship with his father, Mickey dismisses him by saying, "You can't be me, son. You and me are nothing alike," while asking his sheep, "Whose leg do you have to hump to get a pint of Guinness around here?" Peter decides the only way to earn Mickey's respect is to prove he is also a drunk by challenging him to a drinking contest. The Irish characters eagerly bet on this contest while reciting the local, saying, "Let's drink until the alcohol in our system destroys our livers and kills us." The episode treats destructive alcoholism as a charming Irish tradition rather than acknowledging the real health and social problems caused by excessive drinking. When Peter wins the drinking contest, Mickey immediately accepts him as family, saying, "Nobody but a McFinnigan could handle that much of the creature." The episode's message is that Peter's worth as a person comes from his ability to drink dangerously large amounts of alcohol, and that this somehow proves his Irish heritage. The episode ends with a musical number called Drunken Irish Dad that lists dozens of Irish surnames while describing how all Irish fathers are alcoholics who bring shame to their families. The song includes lyrics like, "Oh, his face looks like a railroad map, and he never shuts his freakin' trap. But all the ladies catch the clap from your drunken Irish dad." This reduces an entire ethnic group to a single negative behavior while making light of sexually transmitted diseases. Earlier in the episode, there is also a brief jab at Asian when Stewie visits an Asian Santa at the mall who speaks in broken English and rushes through gift requests, saying, "Too late, take too long, sad Christmas," when children cannot decide quickly enough. This reinforces stereotypes about Asian efficiency taken to an absurd extreme. Family Guy often defends its humor by claiming equal opportunity offense, but this episode shows how that approach can reinforce harmful stereotypes about entire cultures. The show presents Irish alcoholism as charming and traditional rather than addressing it as a serious social issue. The episode uses Peter's emotional search for family acceptance as a vehicle for sustained ethnic humor that reduces Ireland to a collection of drinking-related jokes. Our next episode takes Family Guy boundary-pushing humor into the subject of Jews, money, and financial power in America. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, S3, E22, How Family Guy Built an Entire Episode Around Jewish Money Stereotypes. Peter Griffin decides he needs a Jewish person to handle his finances after hearing his friends brag about their Jewish accountants. Family Guy took the idea that Jewish people are naturally good with money and turned it into 22 minutes of sustained racial humor. The episode starts when Peter wastes the family's emergency money on fake volcano insurance, leaving them unable to buy Meg new glasses after Stewie breaks her current pair. Lois criticizes Peter for being irresponsible with money, leading to him feeling defensive about his financial skills. At the bar, Quagmire and Cleveland start bragging about their financial success thanks to their Jewish accountants. Quagmire mentions Ian Greenstein made smart investments while Cleveland credits Larry Rosenblatt for getting him a huge tax refund. Peter immediately jumps to the conclusion that he needs a Jewish guy to handle my money because of their surnames. When Cleveland suggests that not every Jewish person is good with money, Peter responds, "Well, yeah, not the retarded ones, but why would you even say that?" The episode treats Peter's assumption as logical rather than questioning it. This sets up the main premise. Peter believes he needs to find a Jewish person to solve all his financial problems. Peter then sings a musical number called I Need a Jew, where he literally prays for a Jewish person to help him. He sings, "Nothing else has worked so far, so I'll wish upon a star," and asks for a Baum or Stein or Stin to teach me how to whine and do my taxes. The song includes the line, "Even though they killed my lord, I need a Jew," combining financial stereotypes with religious prejudice. Right as the song ends, Max Weinstein appears at Peter's door with car trouble, and Peter treats this as an answered prayer. Peter immediately assumes Max can help with his finances simply because his name is Max Weinstein. When Max asks how Peter knew he was an accountant, Peter responds, "Hello, Max Weinstein?" as if the name alone proves his profession. Peter then says, "Let's not deny our heritages. You're Jewish. You're good with money. I'm Irish. I drink and I ban homosexuals from marching in my parade." The episode presents these as equivalent ethnic traits. Peter essentially kidnaps Max and forces him to help recover the volcano insurance money. Max reluctantly helps Peter get his money back and balance the family checkbook, but Peter takes all the credit, while Max stands by uncomfortably. The episode shows Max clearly unhappy with the situation, saying, "Look how low I've sunk," taking credit for something a smart Jewish person did, and calling the experience degrading. When the family has Max over for dinner, Peter continues making stereotypical comments. He tells Chris, "God, is there nothing you people can't do? I mean, other than manual labor?" When Lois points out that Jewish people built the pyramids, it reinforces the idea that Jews don't do physical work. Peter also assumes that Max's Friday temple attendance is like Indiana Jones, and jokes about not wanting to give money at synagogue because "I gave at church, and I'm sure it goes to the same God." The content escalates when Peter decides to convert Chris to Judaism purely to make him smarter. Peter tells Lois, "I'm gonna make Chris Jewish because he believes it will help Chris succeed academically." When the rabbi explains that conversion requires serious commitment and study, Peter dismisses this and looks for a quick solution, eventually taking Chris to Las Vegas for a quickie bar mitzvah. At the synagogue, Peter makes more assumptions about Jewish success. He points out various successful people and says, "Hey, I didn't know the principal of Meg's school was Jewish. Hey, there's Bill Nye the Science Guy, and half of Lenny Kravitz. Optimus Prime? He's Jewish?" The episode connects Jewish identity directly to professional achievement and intelligence. The episode ends with Peter realizing his mistake, but not because he recognizes his assumptions as wrong. Instead, he concludes that the Jewish are just like us, no better, no worse. This resolution misses the point. The problem wasn't that Peter thought Jewish people were better, but that he reduced an entire religious and ethnic group to money-related stereotypes. Throughout the episode, nearly every Jewish character or reference connects to financial success or intelligence. While Max Weinstein is portrayed sympathetically as the victim of Peter's assumptions, the episode still uses his character to reinforce the very stereotypes it appears to critique. The show presents Peter's thinking as misguided but understandable, rather than recognizing it as prejudice. Family Guy often has characters learn lessons to justify controversial content, but this episode's resolution feels incomplete. Peter's realization that Jewish people are just like us doesn't address the deeper issue of reducing any ethnic or religious group to stereotypical traits. The episode spent most of its runtime using these assumptions for comedy rather than meaningfully challenging them. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. In the next episode, we see how Family Guy treats a sensitive topic like the Holocaust with such comedic carelessness. Road to Germany, S7, E3. When Family Guy turned the Holocaust into a time travel comedy, Stewie and Brian travel back to Nazi-occupied Poland to rescue Mort Goldman, who accidentally got sent there by Stewie's time machine. This story puts a Jewish character in mortal danger during the Holocaust and uses that terror as comedy material. Mort disappears while using the bathroom during the Griffin family's Oscar party. Stewie and Brian discover he accidentally activated a time machine and got sent to September 1st, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland. When they arrive to find him, Mort is at his grandfather's wedding celebrating with relatives he introduces as my frugal Aunt Ruth, my thrifty Uncle Isaac, my bargain-hunting Aunt Flo, and my great-aunt Vera, who didn't like to spend a lot on anything. Every single Jewish family member gets defined by their relationship to money. When Nazi soldiers crash the wedding, Mort panics. "Oh, they're awful, those Nazis. If they catch me, they'll beat me unmerciful and rub dirt in my ass, neck, and all over my antsy nipples." His terror is genuine. He's a Jewish person trapped in Nazi territory at the worst possible moment. But his crude complaints about his body parts become running gags throughout their escape. At a Nazi checkpoint, they disguise Mort as a Catholic priest. He attempts last rites. "Dear God, the non-Jewish God, be a mensch." I mean, a good guy, because it says in the old book. Not so old though, you know, still good, still good. "We pray in the name of you and of your son who died in a freak accident that you can't really blame on anyone." When he calls heaven your retail-paying place, a real Nazi priest arrives. The German soldier immediately declares he's a filthy Jew, and they have to run. They steal a motorcycle and fight through Nazi soldiers, Mort's constant swearing and panic create a strange mix where his legitimate fear drives the comedy. He knows he could be tortured and murdered at any moment, but his crude outbursts become punchlines. Fuck you, Stewie. I'm a Jew in Nazi-occupied Europe. Fuck you. Fuck the both of you. He screams while they're being chased. In Berlin, Nazi propaganda posters cover the walls, showing grotesque caricatures of Jewish people with oversized noses. A Nazi caricature artist approaches them saying, "Hey, fellas, you want to get a free caricature?" When Brian sees the anti-Semitic drawings, he comments, "Look at the offensive way they draw Jewish people." But this gets treated like just another throwaway observation rather than a condemnation of hate propaganda. They infiltrate Hitler's atomic research facility to steal uranium for their broken time machine. Hitler appears as a bumbling character who speaks in modern slang. "Oh, it's a dog-eat-dog, Reich, and I'm wearing bacon pants." When they ask for uranium, he responds cheerfully, "Oh, of course. Give him some uranium, Mean Joe Green." The man responsible for ordering the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people gets turned into a cartoon character who's happy to help the protagonists. Mean Joe Green, a black NFL player, hands over the uranium saying, "Hey kid, catch." Hitler adds, "He's not really mean at all. No, he's a nice guy." The scene plays out like a heartwarming commercial where Hitler and a famous athlete work together to help our heroes, completely disconnected from historical reality. Throughout their adventure, Mort's Jewish identity creates both legitimate terror and constant comedy. When he says, "I hate it here. I hate this whole goddamn place. It's all a bunch of shit," his anger is completely justified. He's experiencing the same fear that led to the deaths of millions of real people, but his profanity and panic also drive most of the laughs. The story treats Nazi Germany like a wacky historical theme park where Hitler is a goofball, propaganda becomes background decoration, and a Jewish character's terror about genocide provides comic relief. Mort does make it home safely, but only after experiencing psychological trauma that gets mined for jokes throughout the episode. When they return to the present, Mort's ordeal gets treated like any other Family Guy adventure. The fact that he nearly died during the Holocaust becomes just another crazy story to forget about. His relatives, money-obsessed stereotypes, his fumbled attempts at hiding his Jewish identity, and his genuine terror about Nazi persecution all become something to joke about rather than meaningful commentary about anti-Semitism or historical tragedy. The time travel premise allows the show to explore Holocaust themes while maintaining distance from real consequences. Since these are cartoon characters visiting the past, the story can include Nazi imagery and Jewish persecution while treating it like adventure comedy, but this approach trivializes one of history's worst human tragedies. This next episode dares to make insensitive jokes about shooting an unarmed black man. A shot in the dark, S14, E9. When Family Guy tackled police shootings and made everyone uncomfortable, Peter Griffin accidentally shoots Cleveland Jr. during a neighborhood watch patrol, leading to accusations of racial bias and a hate crime trial that exposes ugly truths about racial profiling. Peter starts a neighborhood watch group after someone steals his couch from the front yard. He gets matching shirts made and somehow gets guns for everyone, even though Joe warns them about proper licensing and safety training. This is typical Peter Griffin behavior. C. He overreacts to a small problem and turns it into something dangerous. What starts as someone stealing a couch becomes an armed patrol with regular people carrying weapons who have no training. During a late-night patrol, Peter sees someone climbing through a window and thinks someone is breaking in. He yells warnings and shoots his gun when the person does not respond. Then he finds out he shot Cleveland Jr., who was just trying to get into his own house through the window so he would not let the air conditioning out. Cleveland Jr. was wearing headphones and could not hear Peter yelling at him. You can see Peter is genuinely shocked and horrified at what he did. Cleveland gets angry immediately. He accuses Peter of racial profiling, saying, "You wouldn't have fired that gun if he was white." Peter says that is not true and insists, "I'll shoot anybody," but Cleveland does not believe him. The accusation of racism really hits Peter hard because he honestly believes he would have done the same thing no matter what race the person was. But Cleveland sees it differently. His black son got shot by a white neighbor, and he thinks race played a part. The incident quickly becomes a big media story. Cleveland goes on the news asking police to investigate this as a hate crime. He tells the reporter, "My family and I believe this shooting was a hate crime, and we'd like to see Mr. Griffin held accountable for his actions." Peter watches this at home and says, "I love all people. I love blacks. I love Asians. Hell, I even love gay Aborigines," which shows how tone-deaf he is when trying to defend himself against racism accusations. Peter tries different ways to prove he is not racist. He goes to the YMCA to play basketball with black men, thinking this will somehow show he accepts them. The episode shows his desperate attempts to find black friends and prove he is not racist through shallow interactions. His efforts come across as fake rather than real, showing how white people sometimes approach racial problems in the wrong ways. Things get worse when Peter decides to prove his solidarity by painting himself brown and appearing naked in the town square. Lois stops him, calling it offensive and telling him, "You can't pretend to be black." This scene shows Peter has no understanding about racial issues, and he is willing to do blackface, which is one of the most offensive forms of racial mockery in American history. When Peter tries to make things right by visiting Cleveland's house, he accidentally starts a fire that burns down the home. As the family runs out, Peter yells, "Get your family out of that house. If they don't leave, they'll die. Round up your family and get out, or you're all gonna be sorry. Get out now." His choice of words, especially telling a black family to get out, gets seen as a racial threat by people watching, which leads to his arrest for attempted murder. The trial becomes a showcase of racial stereotyping and legal tricks. Peter's lawyer, hired by Carter Pewter-Schmidt, uses clearly racist tactics to defend him. During cross-examination, the lawyer asks Cleveland Jr. about listening to Jay-Z and quotes violent rap lyrics to make him look threatening. He forces Cleveland Jr. to pick up a knife in court, causing panic and making the teenager look dangerous. These tactics deliberately play on racist stereotypes about young black men being violent and criminal. The lawyer's whole strategy relies on racist assumptions. He connects Cleveland Jr. to Chris Brown because they have the same last name, bringing up domestic violence to make all black men look violent. He shows photos of beaten Rihanna to the jury while questioning Cleveland Jr., creating false connections between the innocent teenager and unrelated violence. These courtroom scenes show how the justice system can be manipulated using racial bias. Cleveland gets more and more frustrated as he watches his son get portrayed as a common hoodlum, even though he is a good kid from a good family. The legal proceedings ignore the actual facts, an unarmed teenager entering his own home, and instead focus on making him appear threatening. The episode shows how young black men get treated like criminals, even when they are victims of violence. Peter eventually realizes how wrong the whole situation has become. He stands up in court and says, "Cleveland Jr. doesn't deserve any of this. All those things you heard about Cleveland Jr. were lies. He didn't do anything to me. He's a good kid, from a good family. He takes full responsibility for the shooting and accepts that he should face consequences, no matter what his intentions were." In a surprising twist, Cleveland himself confesses to the shooting, claiming he did it, and that Peter was just taking the blame. This false confession immediately ends media interest in the case, with Cleveland noting, "You want to make the media go away? Just mention black-on-black crime." This cynical observation shows how society pays less attention to violence within black communities compared to incidents between races. The episode ends with Cleveland forgiving Peter, acknowledging that Peter was willing to go to jail for shooting my son and took responsibility. However, Cleveland Jr. has a disturbing final exchange where he threatens Peter with violence, leaving viewers unsure whether this is a joke or real menace. This unclear ending reflects the ongoing tension and unresolved trauma from what happened. Throughout the episode, Family Guy tries to address serious issues like racial profiling, police shootings of unarmed black youth, media coverage of racial incidents, and bias in the justice system. However, the show's comedic approach often undermines how serious these topics are, treating police violence and racial trauma as sources of humor rather than serious social problems. Our next episode shows the hypocrisy around immigration in America. Family Guy holds nothing back in taking apart Republican principles. Padre de Familia, S6, E6, when Family Guy turned immigration into a lesson about hypocrisy. Peter Griffin discovers he is an illegal Mexican immigrant and experiences life as an undocumented worker. This story reveals how quickly someone's views on immigration can change when they become the target of their own prejudice. Peter starts the episode as an over-the-top patriot after attending a Veterans Day parade. He gets so swept up in American pride that he has his penis tattooed to look like the space shuttle with his balls as launch exhaust. His patriotism quickly turns into anti-immigrant paranoia when he sees news coverage about illegal immigrants taking all the good jobs away from Americans. He decides to patrol the borders and keep this town as clean as a Jewish porno. Peter begins targeting anyone he suspects of being undocumented. He has Lois's 5-year-old Korean acupuncturist arrested, calling him a threat to our national security. When Lois points out that the man is a Buddhist, Peter responds, or was he a supreme leader of Al-Qaeda? He throws away Stewie's Speedy Gonzales video because the character is an immigrant and a bad influence on our children, replacing it with Rapid Dave, an American version who tells a cat, "Up your ass, cat," and runs around yelling, "Quickly, run fast." At work, Peter reports his Middle Eastern coworker, Fuad, as an illegal immigrant, prompting company-wide immigration checks. The irony hits when Peter needs his own birth certificate and discovers from his mother that he was born in Mexico when she went there for an abortion. She never filed the paperwork to make him a citizen, meaning, as far as the US government is concerned, you're an illegal Mexican immigrant. Peter gets fired and has to take a citizenship test, which he fails spectacularly. When asked who discovered America, he guesses Dick York, then Dick Sargent. He cannot complete the land of the free and the home of the, saying, home of the Whopper. The immigration officer tries to prove Peter's marriage is fake by asking basic questions about Lois, but Peter cannot answer her birthday, hometown, or favorite activity. Forced to find work as an undocumented immigrant, Peter tries various stereotypical jobs. As a hotel maid, he repeatedly enters a guest's room despite being told to leave, asking, "I clean? I stay and watch? I get involved with lady? You lend me money? You drive my grandmother to doctor's appointment?" The scene plays on assumptions about immigrant workers being pushy and inappropriate. Carter Pewterschmidt hires Peter to work at his mansion, where he lives in servant quarters with 7 other immigrant families sharing a tool shed. Carter makes Peter drink his diabetic blood to test it, and forces him to watch and summarize TV shows since his VCR is broken. The treatment shows how wealthy Americans exploit immigrant labor while treating workers as less than human. Living among other Mexican immigrants, Peter learns about their culture during Cinco de Mayo celebrations. One worker explains, "America is the land of opportunity, but someday we will return to Mexico because our heritage is rich and glorious." When Peter asks if there is more to being Mexican than working hard and lusting after big asses, he discovers Mexican cultural traditions, beyond stereotypes. The episode includes various cultural references that mix legitimate traditions with stereotypical elements. During the celebration, Peter says, later, "I'm gonna go lift free weights in a parking lot." The workers sell bootleg DVDs with hilariously mistranslated titles like "The No Sex Man Comes to Town" for "The 40-Year-Old Virgin" and "My Friend Who Sticks His Penis in a Pie" for "American Pie." When Carter interrupts the celebration, demanding everyone return to work, Peter stands up for immigrant rights. He declares, "This country used to welcome our kind with open arms, but men like Carter Pewterschmidt use us for cheap labor and then try to punish us when we demand to be treated like human beings." He leads an uprising, demanding citizenship for all the workers. Carter offers to make Peter a citizen through his Washington connections, but Peter insists on citizenship for everyone. When the other workers tell him to save himself, Peter delivers a speech about America being a land where a man is paid a wage he can live on, where we flush every time, where 17 miles is not walking distance, where meals are not purchased from a truck and then eaten in a different truck. The episode ends with Peter accepting citizenship and abandoning his fellow workers, saying, "Being an immigrant is a real pain in the ass." After experiencing discrimination firsthand, he immediately returns to his privileged position without helping others escape the same treatment. Throughout the story, Peter's transformation from anti-immigrant zealot to undocumented worker exposes the hypocrisy in immigration debates. The episode shows how people's attitudes change when they experience discrimination personally, but it also reinforces stereotypes about Mexican culture, immigrant living conditions, and undocumented workers. Peter's quick abandonment of his fellow immigrants once he gets citizenship reveals how self-interest often trumps solidarity. Family Guy uses Peter's immigration experience to comment on American hypocrisy around immigration policy, but the execution relies heavily on stereotypical portrayals of Mexican culture and immigrant life. The show treats serious issues like exploitation of undocumented workers and anti-immigrant discrimination as sources of comedy rather than meaningful social commentary. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Next up, we're examining another episode where Family Guy ruthlessly mocks Indian culture and society. Not for the weak, Road to India, S14, E20, when Family Guy turned tech support into a cross-cultural romance gone wrong. Brian Griffin falls in love with an Indian tech support worker over the phone and travels to India to find her. Indian culture took a major hit from Family Guy in this episode. Brian calls tech support for a computer problem and immediately becomes infatuated with Padma's lovely accent. When she mentions she lives in India, Brian starts making assumptions about her exotic culture, while Stewie mocks the situation, saying Brian has full Bollywood after 1 second of a stranger's voice. Brian continues calling tech support just to talk to Padma, even when his computer works fine. Their phone conversations reveal Brian's complete ignorance about India. He thinks they use metric time when Padma mentions time zones. Despite knowing nothing about her culture or country, Brian decides he loves her and announces his plan to travel to India. Stewie immediately wants to join, telling his yoga class, "The guy I told you about, Brian, he's taking me to India," causing them to squeal with excitement. When they arrive in India, the episode immediately shows the country through Western stereotypes. The airport scene shows crowds, chaos, and a man with no pupil directing them to transportation. Brian expects to find enlightenment and tranquility, but instead encounters polluted air that makes them cough. They find a taxi with less than 9 people in it, playing into stereotypes about overcrowded vehicles. The train journey continues the stereotypical portrayals. Brian wants steak but gets lectured by passengers. "How dare you? To us, cows are sacred." Another passenger adds, "That's right, you are disrespecting our entire culture. And why did Wes Anderson come here to make his worst movie?" When tensions rise, the passengers threaten them, leading Brian and Stewie to escape using red buttons that eject them from the train. At Padma's workplace, hundreds of tech support workers crowd into a massive call center. Brian has to call tech support to locate Padma among the crowd, shouting, "Stand on your desk" over the phone until she appears. The workplace shows Indian workers as interchangeable parts in a customer service machine, with one worker saying, "I am Renita. There is a python in my cube." Padma takes them on a tour of her hometown, which Brian calls magical, despite knowing nothing about it. Stewie makes jokes about attending an Indian party, where they'll play that one song with the shrieking, nasal, atonal woman over the bongos and tambourines. When they attend Padma's family celebration, the episode includes traditional music that matches Stewie's mocking description exactly. The celebration reveals that Padma is engaged to Dheeraj in an arranged marriage. Her father has already paid a dowry and expects the wedding to proceed. When Padma declares her love for Brian instead, her father demands repayment before she can marry anyone else. Brian promises to raise the money to buy Padma's freedom, treating her like property rather than a person making choices. Stewie sets up a medical practice removing tapeworms from locals, claiming there are 1 billion people here, and almost every one of them has a tapeworm. When a patient emerges, Stewie asks, "How long have you been in there?" She responds, "I originally came for my junior year, but I fell in love with the place," revealing she actually is an American study abroad student. Desperate for money, Brian appears on the Indian version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The host asks, "Which retired Indian cricketer has scored over 18,000 runs in ODI competition?" Brian responds, "Well, I know the answer is not Jiminy Cricket, unless Jiminy's based on a real person. The more I say it, the more it does sound Indian. Jiminy Cricket, final answer." His wrong answer treats Indian culture as a joke. The resolution comes when Padma tells Brian, "I realize something. You know nothing of my country or my culture." She explains that watching him fail, the cricket question made her understand their incompatibility, saying, "Everyone in India knows who Sachin Tendulkar is." She admits she used Brian to escape an unwanted marriage rather than genuinely loving him. Throughout the episode, Indian characters speak in exaggerated accents and formal English that makes them sound foreign. The visual depictions emphasize poverty, crowds, and chaos, while ignoring India's technological advancement and modern development. The episode treats arranged marriage as purely financial oppression without exploring cultural context or acknowledging that many such marriages involve genuine compatibility and family support. Brian's journey represents the Western tourist mentality of expecting other cultures to provide enlightenment without understanding local customs or perspectives. His disappointment when India does not match his romanticized expectations reflects common attitudes about exotic destinations. The episode uses India as a backdrop for Brian's romantic comedy, rather than engaging seriously with cultural barriers or meaningful cross-cultural exploration. Next up, we're examining another episode where Family Guy carelessly delves into Mexican culture and immigration. Dearly Deported, S15-19, when Family Guy turned immigration into a cross-cultural romance gone wrong. Chris Griffin falls in love with Isabella, a Mexican woman who gets deported, leading the family on a journey to Mexico filled with every joke on immigration, border crossings, and Mexican culture. This story uses deportation as a plot device while reinforcing assumptions about Mexican identity and immigration status. The episode begins at a water park where Chris meets Isabella after her bikini top comes off on a slide. She asks for help getting it back from his shorts, leading to an awkward but successful first meeting. When Isabella mentions her aunt is waiting, Chris recognizes her as Consuela, the Griffin's housekeeper. "You two know each other?" Isabella asks. Chris responds enthusiastically, "Oh yeah, lemon pledge, no, all that stuff." Consuela shows up and says her usual broken English, "Is time to go." "Lemon pledge, no." Chris laughs and points. "See?" He treats Consuela's way of talking like entertainment instead of seeing her as a real person. During their first date, Chris decides to impress Isabella by being culturally sensitive. "Listen, this is probably lame, but I learned a little bit of your language, and I just wanted to say." Then he starts speaking what he thinks is romantic Spanish, but turns out to be Korean phrases. Isabella looks confused and asks, "What language is that? You're Korean, are you not?" When she tells him, "No, I'm Mexican," Chris keeps speaking Korean while laughing nervously. He completely misses how assuming all non-white people are. The same shows his ignorance. The relationship develops with Chris taking care of Isabella's twin babies, but everything changes when Isabella shows up at his window late one night. "Chris, I just wanted to say goodbye," she tells him sadly. When he asks what she means, she explains, "I found out that I'm going to be deported. They're sending me back to Mexico in the morning." Peter immediately questions the timing. So, in other words, this could have waited till the morning? He treats her emotional goodbye like an inconvenience instead of recognizing this is a family crisis. When Chris asks about the babies, Isabella explains she cannot leave them with Consuela because she works 7 days a week between housekeeping and being the new CEO of Yahoo. The scene cuts to Consuela in a boardroom saying, "Maybe we should improve our business model." When someone suggests improving original content, she responds, No, followed by, "So, we have no corporate identity?" The joke ends with her saying, "We secondary email people use to sign up for porn sites." This reduces Yahoo to its least important function while making Consuela's broken English the punchline. Chris volunteers to care for the babies, which leads to scenes of him struggling with basic childcare. He tries to buy expensive organic food, but discovers it costs $500, so he has to settle for fast food. "Ah, well, sorry kids. Looks like we're gonna go to Jersey Mike's and hope that future science will save us." The babies start crying, and an announcer's voice says, "Jersey Mike's. Bring your girlfriend with the fat ass in here." This treats poor nutrition and crude advertising as connected jokes about class differences. Consuela arrives with news in her usual broken English. "I have good news," and I news. When asked for the bad news first, she announces, "Isabella no can come back." Stuck in Mexico. The babies, they stay here. Lois asks about the good news, and Consuela brightens. "Good news is, bus get new wiper blades. No more, e-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa." She demonstrates the old wiper sound effect. This treats major immigration problems like they are the same as minor car repairs. The family decides to bring the babies to Mexico. Peter announces where they are going with typical enthusiasm. "All right, we're off to Mexico. If you kids are good, we'll bring you back a tangled marionette." When they arrive, Chris confirms they have reached Santa Terrible, a village name that immediately shows the episode's attitude toward Mexican locations. Isabella appears and asks, "What in the mind of Mencia are you doing here?" This references comedian Carlos Mencia, while animal noises, police sirens, and handcuffs clicking create background sounds that suggest constant chaos and crime. When the family suggests leaving the babies with Isabella, Chris objects, "Mom, we cannot just leave them here. This is no place for Isabella to raise a family." While Chris talks, you hear all these animal sounds, chickens clucking, goats making noise, and police sirens going off. Someone gets arrested in the background too. The scene presents Mexico as a place that is not suitable for raising children through these sound effects, instead of exploring actual economic or social factors. Peter suggests getting help from El Chapo by summoning him with magic words. All you got to do is say "dyed black eyebrows" into the wind, and he appears. He explains confidently. When Peter tries this, Peter Gallagher appears instead, followed by Mark Cuban. "Oh, we're getting all the wrong eyebrow guys," Peter complains. He treats drug cartel leaders like they are interchangeable with celebrities based on facial hair while making light of serious organized crime. Their escape attempt fails when corrupt Mexican police arrive. "We're not arresting you, we're taking your plane," one officer announces. And, "Javier, get their keys and take their SUV," he adds, treating police corruption like routine business. Brian responds sarcastically, "Boy, I cannot believe there would be corrupt cops in Mexico," while Peter adds, "Yeah, Donald Trump was right. His daughter is a hot piece of ass." This connects immigration policy to sexual commentary in typical Family Guy fashion. Stranded in the desert, the family encounters actual coyotes, which leads to confusion about the term. "Oh, like Coyote Ugly with Piper Perabo," Brian says, before Peter struggles with the actress's name. Pay re bo, para boo. Brian helps him, Perperabo. Peter responds, "That is weird, but you remember." He treats the pronunciation lesson as more important than the dangerous animals approaching them. When the coyotes attack, Chris fights them off to save the babies, finally showing real responsibility. Consuela rescues them, explaining she found them because baby's earring have chip. The resolution reveals they were already in Texas, leading Peter to observe, "So we walked right across the border and did not even know it. That is a problem, right? I mean, politics aside, we can all agree that is a problem." This ending treats border security as both a joke and a genuine political concern. The episode uses immigration as a source of crude humor while consistently showing Mexican culture through stereotypes. Border crossing gets portrayed as either criminally easy or dangerously difficult. Chris ultimately decides he is too young for such responsibility and returns to his normal life, while Isabella remains separated from American opportunities with her children. Next up, we're examining another episode where Family Guy mocks an entire culture. Let us just say, it is a good thing Amish people are not online. Amish Guy, S1519, when Family Guy made religious tradition into comedy material. While not strictly a racist episode, this story qualifies for our list through its constant mockery of Amish religious beliefs and cultural practices. The Griffin family gets stranded in Amish country when their car breaks down, leading to an episode that treats traditional religious communities as sources of comedy, rather than exploring their beliefs with any respect or understanding. The episode begins with Peter trying and failing to ride the Holocaust roller coaster at Six Flags because he is too overweight. After unsuccessful dieting attempts involving rice cakes and a girdle, the family drives to Ohio where Peter still gets rejected. "I'm sorry, sir. You're too fat to ride the coaster," the operator tells him bluntly. When Peter asks about the weight limit, the operator responds, "The rule is you can't look hilarious on this motor scooter." As Peter sits on a mobility scooter looking dejected, their car breaks down in rural Ohio, forcing them to seek help in what Peter identifies as Amish country. "Hey, Lois, you see that barn out there? You know who it was built by?" he asks before singing, "By Mennonites," to a dramatic musical sting. When they approach an Amish man for lodging, he responds in formal biblical language, "Are ye indeed outsiders?" We do not see many of your folk in these parts, but we welcome all of God's children in their hour of need. Meg quickly gets fascinated with Eli, a young Amish man who shows her around the community. He explains their simple lifestyle. We do chores and we watch other people do chores. When Meg calls this boring, Eli admits, there are times when I feel as if there is much of life I am missing. Meg shares her iPhone with him, creating a playlist of songs he has never heard. When Avril Lavigne plays, Eli asks confused, "Who is this I am hearing? Why does she shout at me?" The cultural clash gets explicit when Eli's father, Ezekiel, discovers them together. "You stay away from her. She will try to corrupt you," he warns Eli sternly. When Eli protests that Meg is wonderful, Ezekiel declares, "She is an outsider. She does not follow the one true path. You are not to see this girl again. Do you understand? I forbid it." He calls Meg a harlot and orders her to stay away from his son. The episode's most offensive moment comes during a community prayer before a barn raising. The Amish leader delivers an extended mock prayer that makes fun of their religious beliefs. "Dear Amish Lord, thou looketh sternly down upon us thine flock, even though we did not do anything wrong and have been doing chores like F. Crazy, please make us humble and deliver us more hardship, that we may get thick, calloused hands, much larger than other people's." The prayer continues, "We solemnly believe that although humans have been around for 1,000,000 years, you feel strongly that they had just the right amount of technology between 1835 and 1850. Not too little, not too much. Please deliver us from Thomas Edison, the worst human being who ever lived." Peter tries to help Meg by talking to Ezekiel during the barn raising. "Look, I just wanted to tell you how much my daughter Meg loves your boy Eli. I promise you, she ain't trying to corrupt him or nothing." When Ezekiel insists they live in different worlds, Peter suggests, "Hey, how do we know what's going to happen? For all we know, Meg might want to Amish herself." Ezekiel considers this possibility, mentioning it is the time of the month when Eli's mother is on the burlap, treating menstruation as a crude punchline. Peter then makes a fatal error by deciding to introduce rock music to the community. "I notice you don't have a damn lick of music in this town," he observes. "Well, I am about to change your mind, introducing rock and roll." He starts singing AC divided by DC's Highway to Hell before getting cut off by outraged Amish elders who immediately banish the family. "You are banished from our community at once. And take your whore daughter with you." The conflict escalates into an Amish feud when Eli runs away with the Griffins. Ezekiel declares war using traditional methods, while Peter assembles modern technology. The Amish attack with quilts and thrown apples, leading to absurd battle cries like, "Quilters, advance." One quilt gets bloodied, prompting the observation, "Up, now it's an AIDS quilt." Peter's side uses modern weapons, with Peter shouting, "Suck on this, you furry little weirdos." The resolution comes when Eli realizes his father's violent behavior contradicts Amish principles. "You were so worried about these outsiders coming into our community and corrupting me, but look at yourself. You're the one who's allowed yourself to be corrupted." Ezekiel admits shame and accepts that Eli should choose his own path, but Eli ultimately decides to remain with his community, telling Meg, "This is where I belong." The episode treats Amish religious practices as objects of ridicule, rather than examining their beliefs with respect. The mock prayer sequence particularly crosses lines by suggesting their theology is absurd, while the cornhole jokes and speech patterns become sources of humor. The story acknowledges some complexity in showing Ezekiel's character growth, but primarily uses traditional religious communities as stuff of jokesel, rather than exploring the genuine tensions between faith traditions and modern life. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The next episode turns a very sensitive subject, like slavery and reparations, into a cash-out opportunity. Peter Griffin, husband, father, brother, S3, E14. When Family Guy turned slavery into an identity crisis comedy. Peter Griffin discovers his ancestor was a black slave owned by the Pewterschmidt family, leading him to believe he is black and attempt to join the African American community. This episode takes one of America's most painful historical legacies and turns it into comedy about racial identity and cultural appropriation. The story begins when Chris starts talking in street slang after playing basketball. "Yo, did y'all check me when that hottie was all up in my Kool-Aid? I was looking to break off something, but my crew gave me the 411 on that skank and she's all about the bling bling. Peter thinks Chris is possessed and tries to perform an exorcism. Meg, start at Psalm 41. Don't stop readin' till I tell you. The power of Christ compels you. Lois stops him, explaining Chris is just talking street like many kids do. Peter gets worried that Chris does not know his own heritage, so he takes him to the library to research Griffin family history. They discover various ancestors including Ossius Griffin, who owned one of the first telephones, and Thomas Griffin, a philosopher whose wife asks him to find work, and he simply responds, "Why?" But when they reach 1840, Peter finds Nathaniel Nate Griffin, who looks exactly like Peter but is clearly identified as a black man. Peter's immediate reaction, "Holy crap, I'm black. But I can't be black." The diary entries confirm this really is Peter's ancestor, complete with Peter's distinctive laugh written out in the text. Chris gets excited. "Cool, I get to be black and Irish. Now I can wear clothes that actually show off my big butt." Peter decides he needs to learn how to be black and asks Cleveland for advice. Cleveland suggests he go out and commingle amongst your newly found brethren and absorb the culture. Peter shows up at a black community center wearing a dashiki and insisting people call him Kichwa Tembo instead of Peter, which he now calls his slave name. When community members are skeptical about his blackness, Peter delivers a speech referencing old television shows. "Judge me not by the color of my skin, for I have always been there with you. I was there when George and Wheezy moved on up to the east side. Oh, hallelujah, those were happy times. But I was also there for the bad times, when Florida lost James to that tragic auto accident. Oh, and I was there when Tootie got those terribly painful braces. And when Arnold Jackson got beat up by the gooch, I was there. So before you decide that I don't belong here, remember this, I was there." The community members respond enthusiastically. "Way to go, Peter. You tell it like it is." The racial dynamics get more complicated when Lois's parents visit and Carter tries to show the family's colonial history. While showing photos, he tries to hide one image, but Peter demands to see it. The photo reveals Nate Griffin as a slave owned by Silas Pewterschmidt. "Lois, your family owned my family," Peter exclaims angrily. Carter dismisses it awkwardly. "It appears so. Boy, this is embarrassing." Peter responds, "Yes, it is. And don't call me boy." When Carter says goodnight to the grandchildren, Peter dramatically falls to the ground. "You can whip me all you like, white devil, but you'll never break my spirit." Peter demands reparations from Carter, specifically asking for an apology and Rice Krispie treats, like Cleveland received from another family. Carter refuses to apologize but offers money instead. "I assume Rice Krispie treats is black slang for money, so here's $10,000. When Peter hesitates, Carter increases it to $20,000, making the news as a reparations payment to a local black man. Instead of using the money responsibly, Peter converts their den into a replica of Pee-wee's Playhouse, complete with talking furniture and colorful decorations. When the black community learns about his wasteful spending, they criticize him for not sharing the money like Cleveland did. "I shared mine. You, however, have given nothing back to the community," one member tells him. Peter tries to defend himself. "I've brought you the greatest gift of all, a child's laughter," but they ask him to leave. The resolution comes when Peter gets visited by the ghost of Nate Griffin, who tells him to stop putting so much importance on race. Nate explains that the most important thing is how a man acts, and suggests Peter do something good with the reparation money. Before leaving, Nate reveals he peed in their cereal every morning as his own form of rebellion against the Pewterschmidt family. Peter decides to share the reparations money with his brothers at a community gathering, though he initially clarifies he just meant the black guys when white people also approach. The episode ends with Peter concluding that it doesn't matter if you're black or white, the only color that really matters is green. Throughout the episode, Peter's journey involves adopting what he thinks is black culture through stereotypical behaviors and TV show references rather than genuine understanding. The slavery storyline gets treated as a source of family embarrassment and financial opportunity rather than serious historical trauma. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying these episode breakdowns. Next up, we're examining an episode where Family Guy treats being black as a commodity to acquire in order to be cool. Prepare for all the cool black guy stereotypes that will make your stomach turn. Jerome is the new black, S8E7, when Family Guy made finding a black friend into a shopping list. Peter Griffin and his friends decide they need to find a black guy to replace Cleveland in their friend group. This episode shows how looking for diversity can become racist when you treat people like they are just their race instead of real individuals. The story starts with Peter, Joe, and Quagmire sitting at their usual table at the Clam, staring at Cleveland's empty chair. After they mistake a lamp for Cleveland coming back, Peter says, "We need a new fourth guy for our group. We're a man short." When Brian suggests he could join them, they immediately say no because Quagmire hates you. So they start looking for a replacement friend. The big moment comes when Peter says what they have all been thinking. "If you really break it down, what we need is a black guy." Joe immediately agrees, saying, "Yeah, that was the best thing about Cleveland." Quagmire adds, "Oh, by far, I sure do miss him." They do not miss Cleveland's personality, his jokes, or his friendship. They specifically miss having a black person in their group because it made them feel less like a bunch of boring white guys. They meet Jerome at the Clam when he offers to be their fourth player in a darts tournament. Jerome talks in over-the-top slang, calling them "sorry a *** fools," and using phrases like "mother lovin' fourth." When he shows off his dart skills, Quagmire says, "Gentlemen, we got us a black man," like they just won a prize, instead of meeting a new friend. Jerome's race becomes the main reason they want him in their group. Jerome matches exactly what they expect a black friend should be like. He talks about his watch not telling time because "I tell it," claims he has time for whatever I want, and mentions buying a framed painting of a tiger at a gas station. These details play into stereotypes about black culture while making Jerome seem effortlessly cool compared to the white characters and their boring suburban lives. Things get more complicated when Peter brings Jerome home and finds out that Jerome and Lois dated before Peter and Lois got married. Peter's reaction goes beyond normal jealousy. He seems specifically bothered that Lois was with a black man. His shock and discomfort show deeper racial anxieties about interracial relationships that go way past regular romantic jealousy. Jerome becomes the perfect house guest. He saves Lois from choking and makes delicious scones for breakfast. But Peter cannot get past the fact that Jerome used to slip her the old Pringles can. When Peter complains to Joe and Quagmire, they brush off his concerns because Jerome is the coolest guy we've met since Cleveland left. They care more about having a cool black friend than they do about Peter's relationship worries. Peter's jealousy leads him to burn down Jerome's house, which forces Jerome to move in with the Griffins for a while. Peter then tries more and more desperate tactics to get rid of Jerome, including dressing up as a ghost to scare him away. When Peter finally explodes and demands Jerome leave, Jerome responds with real hurt, saying, "I thought I found a true friend in you." The episode wraps up when Lois shows Peter a thoughtful gift Jerome left as a thank you. He gave them a prop from Family Ties that Peter would love as a fan of the show. This makes Peter realize Jerome was genuinely trying to be a good friend instead of trying to steal Lois. Peter apologizes and admits he let jealousy control him because Jerome was such a cool guy that Peter worried he was cool enough to steal you away from me. But the episode has one final twist. Jerome reveals that he did sleep with Meg while staying at their house, which Peter dismisses by saying, "I don't care about that." This double standard shows how Peter's concerns were specifically about Jerome and Lois, not about Jerome's character or whether he could be trusted in general. Throughout the episode, Jerome gets treated like a racial commodity instead of an individual person. His friends value him specifically for being black and bringing coolness to their group. All his personality traits match stereotypical expectations about black culture and behavior. Even his name Jerome plays into racial assumptions, while the episode title, Jerome is the New Black, treats blackness like a replaceable item rather than a human identity. The episode also has a side story where Brian tries to become friends with Quagmire and learns exactly why Quagmire hates him. Quagmire gives a brutal speech listing all of Brian's flaws, calling him pretentious, hypocritical, and boring. This side story contrasts with the main plot by showing genuine personality-based dislike versus the racial tokenism in Peter's friend search. Family Guy uses this episode to explore how diversity efforts can become their own form of racism when people get reduced to demographic categories. The characters do not want to know Jerome as an individual person. They want him as their designated black friend who will make them seem cooler and less boring. This approach treats racial identity like a social accessory instead of recognizing Jerome as a complete person with his own interests and personality. Our next episode dives into offensive Chinese stereotypes about manufacturing and politics, with jokes that will make Chinese people very uncomfortable. China Doll, S2311. When Family Guy turned manufacturing labels into cultural identity comedy. When Stewie found out his teddy bear Rupert was made in China, it ignited his imagination and motivated him to embrace on a trip to thank the creators of his dear companion. The story starts when Brian digs this hole in the yard and accidentally buries Rupert. When Stewie gives his bear a bath later, he sees the Made in China sticker and goes, "Rupert, you're Chinese? I had no idea. My word, all these years, I have been in a multicultural relationship." Then he starts acting completely ridiculous. Next thing you know, Stewie walks around saying ni hao and wearing what looks like a costume from a Halloween store. When Brian asks, "Why are you dressed like that?" Stewie responds, "Oh my God, that is such a year of the monkey thing to ask." Then he starts doing this whole zodiac thing, where he calls Brian a monkey because of his age, and says he is year of the pig. The whole thing is pretty weird. Later, Stewie decides to fix medical shows to be more culturally appropriate. So he watches ER and dubs over the doctors. Instead of "I need 10 cc's of medicine," he makes them say ginseng root. Instead of proper medical equipment, he substitutes goldfish to nibble his toes and baby elephant bones. He basically makes up random stuff he thinks counts as Eastern medicine. Then Stewie gets this idea that Rupert needs to find his birth parents in China. He puts the bear by the window facing what he thinks is east, though Brian points out the direction is actually north. When Brian tries to correct him, Stewie responds, "Shut up, Brian. We're going to China while this gong sound plays." Even Stewie tells the sound guy to chill with all the gong noises. So they fly to China, and Stewie immediately starts walking up to random people, saying, "Hey, thanks for making our stuff. Thank you. Our country stopped making stuff, so thank you for making the stuff, 'cause we still need stuff." He treats everyone like they work in a factory. At this actual factory, Stewie decides the workers must be Rupert's parents because this one woman has Rupert's same non-smile, and some guy has Rupert's glassy, dead eyes. He introduces himself as Stewie Griffin Dockers 3, yes, of the Pants Dockers, and compliments their cute hole they give you for a toilet. The workers keep saying, "Okay," because they have no idea what this weird baby is talking about. Things go south fast when Stewie tries to ask permission to marry his teddy bear. The Chinese government arrests them for being spies and for aggravated sodomy against a stuffed animal. They end up in this labor camp making solar panels while the guards make jokes about American politics. The punishment involves having to watch the movie Tar and answer questions about conducting. The interrogator asks, "What does a conductor actually do? Why couldn't the best musicians in the world play music without some maniac waving a stick in front of them?" Then they threaten to make them watch Maestro next, which apparently counts as torture. When they try to escape, they run through what Brian calls the village of Chinese stereotypes and the obligatory Chinese New Year parade. They hide behind terracotta soldiers, but accidentally knock them over, which makes everyone mad. To get out of trouble, they throw Chris under the bus by telling the authorities he is famous pro-Tibet activist Richard Gere. The episode ends with Chris pretending to be Richard Gere, making up stories about Pretty Woman, while Chinese officials try to figure out if he really is the actor. The whole episode treats China like this weird theme park instead of a real place with real people. Stewie thinks he can understand Chinese culture by putting on costumes and saying random phrases. The show makes China look like nothing but factories, government oppression, and tourist attractions. Instead of actually learning about Chinese culture, Stewie performs what he thinks the culture should look like. Thanks for watching this breakdown. Hit subscribe and the bell icon if you want to see more episodes like this one. See you next time. Family Guy, White Meg Can't Jump S, 21, E14, race jokes hidden in a basketball story. Meg Griffin finally gets a spotlight episode in White Meg Can't Jump, where she joins the high school basketball team and, against all odds, becomes the star player. While the surface story is about Meg finally winning at something, the background humor relies on the same mix of cruelty, sexism, and More importantly, racial jokes that the show has leaned on for years. The setup is simple. Meg is noticed in the cafeteria for boxing other kids out of line, and the coach, desperate to make his team competitive, invites her to join. For once, Meg is encouraged instead of mocked, though Peter is forced to come along to support her. Of course, Peter doesn't support Meg in the traditional sense. Instead, his non-stop insults during practice light a fire in her. Every cruel joke pushes her to play better, which creates an uncomfortable foundation. Her success comes only when she's humiliated. On the surface, this dynamic could have been left at the level of family dysfunction, but the episode mixes in a series of race-related gags that tie directly into basketball culture and public stereotypes. At the halftime commentary of one game, the announcer grumbles, "Oh, suddenly, the fighty whiteys is offensive. Take off the sweatshirt." The joke is played as absurd political correctness, suggesting that audiences are overreacting about offensive team names. But the reality is that team names mocking racial identity have long been debated in real sports culture, from Redskins to Indians, and brushing it off with a sarcastic line normalizes dismissiveness toward those concerns. Later, Peter heckles Meg by shouting, "Hey Meg, you play like Kobe, beef." On its face, it's just another cheap dig, turning Kobe Bryant's name into a pun. But think about where it lands. Kobe isn't just any player. He was one of the most iconic black athletes in basketball history. Reducing his legacy to a food joke not only disrespects his memory, but also diminishes what he represented in the sport. Instead of recognizing skill, the joke collapses a black athlete's identity into a meaningless pun, stripping the seriousness of basketball culture away for the sake of a lazy laugh. This pattern shows how Family Guy often uses race as disposable comedy. The Fighty Whitey's gag and the Kobe pun both trivialize sensitive topics by disguising them as harmless wordplay. In reality, they reinforce stereotypes. One mocks legitimate conversations about racial respect. The other exploits the name of a black sports legend to degrade a white teenage girl's game. Both jokes use black culture and identity as the punchline, without offering any deeper thought or awareness. The way Meg's story unfolds makes these racial undertones even more jarring. She actually thrives under Peter's abuse, playing harder, jumping higher, and hitting shots she normally wouldn't. But when Peter loses his voice, she immediately collapses. The moment that should have been her true victory is built on Peter's final insult, "Shut up, Meg," which somehow empowers her to win the championship. The entire plot sends a warped message. Meg can only succeed when she's insulted, and the culture of insults themselves is filled with dismissive jokes, including ones that drag racial humor into the mix. The aftermath plays this straight. Meg wins the game, the school celebrates, and the episode closes with a sense of triumph. But there's no reflection on how she was treated, nor on the fact that the basketball setting was used mainly as a stage for offhand racial commentary. The win feels hollow because Meg's supposed empowerment was fueled not by her own growth, but by years of humiliation crystallized into a single dad insult. The racist jokes remain untouched, presented as harmless, throwaway gags. When you step back, the long-term effect of episodes like this becomes clearer. Family Guy positions itself as an equal opportunity offender, but that label often disguises the fact that certain groups, particularly racial minorities, get reduced to stereotypes more often than others. By dismissing offensive team names as just political correctness gone too far, the show minimizes real-world conversations about racism in sports. By turning Kobe Bryant's name into a joke, it shows how quickly black achievement can be reduced to nonsense when it serves a punchline. This leaves viewers with a mixed message. On one hand, Meg finally gets her victory. On the other hand, her story is tied to a system of abuse and casual racism that the show never questions. Instead of celebrating her as a character who grew past her family's cruelty, the episode doubles down on the same themes of humiliation, with racial humor added to fill the gaps. In the end, White Meg Can't Jump isn't really about Meg becoming a basketball star. It's about Family Guy once again showing how far it's willing to go for a laugh, even if that means dragging race into a storyline where it adds nothing. For longtime fans, the jokes may slide by as familiar background noise, but for anyone looking closer, they highlight the way the show treats race as a laughingstock instead of a subject worth handling with care. And in an episode where Meg should have finally had her win without strings attached, The reliance on race-based jokes makes her victory feel like just another missed opportunity. But in the next episode, Family Guy offends even more races. Brian writes a bestseller, S9E6, when Family Guy turned black suffering into a punchline. This episode is called Brian Writes a Bestseller. On the surface, the story is about Brian finally getting success as a writer. He gives up on serious novels and writes a simple self-help book with Stewie's help. The book becomes a hit, and Brian's ego grows until his arrogance brings him down. That is the main plot. But hidden inside this plot are moments of racial humor you won't forget anytime soon. The first example comes when Stewie organizes Brian's publicity tour. He tells Brian proudly that he asked the airline not to seat him next to an Asian passenger. This is a very quick line, but it is one of the clearest racial jokes in the episode. The humor is not about Brian's book or about Stewie being controlling. The humor comes only from the idea that sitting next to an Asian person on a plane is unpleasant. That reflects a real prejudice. It connects to old stereotypes about Asian travelers being noisy, unhygienic, or foreign. The joke does not challenge that stereotype. It accepts it and turns it into entertainment. Because Stewie is the one who says the line, the writers can hide behind his character. He is a baby, and he often says extreme things. But the fact remains, the joke is about avoiding an Asian person. For many viewers, that is not just a dark joke, but a reminder of real discrimination they face in daily life. Later, during Brian's promotional events, the story brings in another racial gag. When Brian checks into a hotel, the receptionist greets him warmly and admires his book. Instead of showing gratitude, Stewie focuses on her name. He mispronounces it in an exaggerated way and laughs at how foreign it sounds. This scene does not add to the story. It only works as a joke about ethnic names being strange. Again, the message is clear. People who do not have English names are treated as different, and that difference becomes the joke. For viewers with foreign names, this hits close to home. It turns their identity into comedy. A third moment comes during a cutaway at Penguin Publishing. A struggling writer is told, "If you want to be in black and white has to be in you." This line mixes two ideas, the fact that books are printed in black and white, and the idea of being black. The joke is wordplay, but it makes race into a silly pun. It reduces being black to something that can be thrown into a one-liner. This scene might look harmless if you see it alone, but when you place it beside the other jokes in this episode, the Asian passenger remark, the foreign name gag, it becomes part of a larger picture. The episode keeps turning race into a small laugh, even though the plot has nothing to do with race at all. When the story reaches the end, Brian is exposed as a fraud. He appears on Real Time with Bill Maher and cannot defend his book against serious thinkers. The lesson is about Brian's pride and his lack of real talent. But notice what the lesson is not about. None of the racist comments are questioned. Nobody calls out Stewie for asking to avoid an Asian passenger. Nobody challenges his ridicule of a woman's name. These jokes are left in the background, free from criticism. They are there only to get laughs from the audience. That is what makes this episode important to discuss. The racial content is not the headline of the story, but it still exists. It is slipped in between scenes, presented as normal, and then forgotten. But the jokes do not just disappear. They reinforce stereotypes. They encourage the idea that mocking names, mocking ethnic groups, or using black identity as a pun is acceptable in comedy. Compared to other Family Guy episodes, Brian Writes a Bestseller is not often labeled as one of the big race episodes, but this is exactly why it matters. Racism here is quiet, almost hidden. It is not the center of attention, yet it shapes how viewers laugh. The harm is in how casual it feels. Racism is not the theme of the story, but it is sprinkled in as easy humor. That normalizes it. This episode shows a pattern that runs through much of the series. Even when the writers are focused on a different subject, in this case, a satire of publishing, they still pull in racial jokes as filler. They do not need them for the plot, but they use them anyway, because they know the audience will laugh. That choice reveals something about the show's approach to race. It is not used to challenge prejudice. It is used as a shortcut for comedy. Brian Writes a Bestseller might not shock viewers with overt racism, but when you look closely, the Asian passenger joke, the ethnic name gag, and the Penguin Publishing pun all show the same tendency. Race becomes the punchline. That is why this episode deserves a place in a list of the most racist Family Guy episodes. It may not be obvious, but it shows how deep and constant the pattern really is. This next one really points fingers, forces you to as who's the real racist here? Trump Guy, S17E11, when Family Guy sets Peter Griffin loose on Trump and we decide who's more racist. The episode Trump Guy is remembered for its over-the-top fight between Peter Griffin and Donald Trump, but beneath the punches and slapstick is a steady stream of race-coded jokes and tropes. The writers use Trump as a stage to recycle old Family Guy habits, mocking ethnic groups, leaning on stereotypes, and slipping in cultural slurs while pretending it is all political satire. The racial coding starts almost immediately after the Griffins arrive in Washington. Peter is thrilled about their new home and daydreams about what life in the capital will be like. He even suggests their kids could attend local schools. Lois shuts him down in an instant. She says, "Our kids aren't going to public school in D.C." The line hangs in the air with no explanation. The audience is expected to get the joke without one, and the joke depends on a stereotype that D.C. public schools, filled mostly with Black and Latino students, are places no good family would send their children. By letting Lois speak bluntly, without reasons or follow-up, the show counts on the audience to connect the dots, that her fear is really about race and class. From there, the cutaway gags take the same approach. In one scene, a cowboy walks into a Chinese Starbucks. He looks around, confused, then relaxes, saying it feels the same as any other Starbucks. The image is meant to be funny because of how strange the setting looks, but the writers only had to show signs in Chinese characters and exaggerated decor to sell the gag. Once again, the joke reduces an entire culture to wallpaper strange, foreign, and laughable until a white man decides it's familiar enough. The party at the White House piles on with another set of stereotypes. A group of men speaking broken English stumble through conversations about passwords and fake names. They are Russians, drawn as clumsy and suspicious, forever linked to corruption and spying. While it references real politics, the humor is built on mocking their accents and turning national identity into a gag. The Russians are not characters with depth. They are props meant to be laughed at because of how they talk. Later, Ivanka Trump arrives and compliments Meg, telling her she could be beautiful enough to marry an Orthodox Jewish son of a felon who's too stupid to get into Harvard the normal way. The joke targets Jared Kushner, but notice how the joke drags religion into the mud. By naming Orthodox Jewish alongside crime and stupidity, the writers link a faith identity to corruption. The satire could have gone straight for Jared as an individual, but instead the show broadens the insult to touch an entire group. That choice moves the joke from political to prejudiced. The most uncomfortable moment arrives when Meg accuses Trump of assaulting her. She insists he touched her without consent. Her family dismisses her instantly. Peter even tells her that people hate liars. In that short exchange, the show mirrors real-world cases where survivors are ignored, but it also frames the accusation as just another setup for comedy. The writers are trying to reflect Trump's scandals, yet the way the scene is handled makes light of assault and shows how easily women's voices are brushed aside. The problem is not only the subject matter, but how quickly it is recycled into a running gag about Meg being unbelievable. The rooftop fight between Peter and Trump gives the clearest statement on race. Trump yells at Peter that Family Guy taught children their favorite Jewish, Black, and gay jokes. It is framed as Trump attacking the show's record, but the line also acts like a confession. For years, Family Guy has leaned on racist and homophobic punchlines. Here, the writers try to distance themselves by putting the words in Trump's mouth, as if that erases their own role. But the joke still lists identities as punchlines: Jewish, Black, gay, as if the audience should laugh, just hearing them grouped together. The climax even finds room for international stereotypes. As Peter is losing the fight, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appears in a kayak to save him. Trudeau is drawn as handsome, calm, and effortlessly heroic. The contrast is clear. The Canadian leader is everything Trump is not. But the choice of a kayak, the polite voice, the outdoor look, all of it leans into a stereotype of Canadians as the good white neighbor. It flatters Canada while mocking America, yet leaves out any voices of color altogether. The episode ends with Peter admitting he can be insulting, but arguing that, as a cartoon character, he can be turned off. Trump, he says, cannot. On the surface, it's a joke about the difference between television and politics, but it is also the show's defense for its own offensive jokes. By calling itself just a cartoon, Family Guy tries to excuse the way it relies on race and identity for cheap laughs. The writers frame Trump as the real danger, while ignoring how their own jokes reinforce bias in smaller, but steady, doses. Seen from start to finish, Trump Guy is more than a parody of one politician. It uses Trump as cover to repackage the same old racial humor. Asian stereotypes for a Starbucks gag, Russians mocked for accents, Jewish identity tied to crime, and women's voices laughed off as lies. The fight scene may be what fans remember, but the racial jokes are what leave the lasting impression. By mixing politics with prejudice, the episode shows how Family Guy keeps crossing the same line again and again. If you're enjoying this series, then don't forget to subscribe, because our next episode is a fan-favorite crossover, but it won't be. Family Guy is racist jokes don't fly here and there. The Simpsons Guy, S13, E1, When Family Guy Met the Simpsons. The Simpsons Guy is remembered as the long-awaited crossover between two of the biggest animated sitcoms ever made. Fans expected a celebration of cartoon history. The Griffins meet the Simpsons, worlds collide, and hilarity follows. On the surface, it's fun, but beneath the bright colors, this episode quietly shows how Family Guy leans on racism, even when the story isn't about race at all. The setup is simple. Peter creates a sexist comic strip, gets run out of town, and the Griffins end up stranded in Springfield. The rest of the episode is a parade of gags, but listen closely, and you'll notice how often those gags fall back on race, immigrant stereotypes, and communities being described as dirty or diseased. The first clear example comes at the Quick E Mart. When the Griffins meet Apu, Peter instantly makes a comparison that tells you everything about how the show views him. He calls Apu funny-sounding Cleveland. That line reduces Apu to nothing more than his accent. The writers don't even bother building a joke. The voice itself is the punchline. Then Apu doubles down on the stereotype, telling them, I am from a country where the words for sewage and beverage are the same. That's not clever. That's not satire. It's the same old racist trope India as filthy, unhygienic, unworthy of respect. Instead of giving Apu more humanity in this crossover, the show makes him an even bigger caricature. The humor doesn't stop there. Later, when the family tours Springfield, Peter looks around and sneers. Everybody around here looks like they have hepatitis. On the surface, the joke is about the Simpsons' yellow skin, but the structure of the joke is old, linking a community's appearance to disease. In the real world, immigrants and minorities have often been dehumanized with the same language, painted as sick or unclean. The show relies on the audience recognizing that stereotype for the line to work. It's not just about yellow cartoons. It's about how racism is normalized through jokes about disease. Even Bart's prank calls get dragged into this pattern. Bart teaches Stewie how to do his classic phone gag with a silly name like Lee Keebum. Stewie takes it darker, calling Mo and saying, "Your sister's being raped." While not racial, it shows the Family Guy formula. Take something light and innocent, then twist it into cruelty. The same formula is applied to race. Instead of clever setups, they go for shock value. And the easiest way to shock? Punch down at marginalized groups. At Moe's Tavern, Homer and Peter chat with Springfield regulars. Chief Wiggum shows up, and Peter mocks the way Springfield police behave. It seems like a jab at lazy cops, but for Family Guy fans, it echoes the way Quahog's officers, especially Joe Swanson, are framed. Family Guy has a long history of linking incompetence in law enforcement with race-coded jokes. Here, the gag feels like a callback, smuggling in that same racial rhythm. Even the dinner table scene plays into exclusion. Brian joins the Simpsons for a meal, but Marge tells him, "Dogs eat in the kitchen." On paper, it's just a class joke, Brian being treated like an animal. But the setup mirrors a familiar real-world script, minorities being told they don't belong at the same table, that they should eat separately. It's quick, easy to miss, but the framework is there. What makes this episode stand out is how it treats Apu. By 2014, when this crossover aired, Apu was already a controversial figure. Critics had pointed out for years that he reduced South Asians to stereotypes, the funny accent, the convenience store, the overworked immigrant. Instead of addressing that, Family Guy makes it worse. Apu's big contribution to the crossover is the sewage and beverage joke. That's his moment. Not a real story, not a chance at humanity, just another cheap laugh at the expense of an immigrant identity. Step back, and the pattern becomes clear. Peter leaves Quahog because his sexist jokes went too far. He arrives in Springfield, and the humor immediately shifts into racial territory. Springfield is described as diseased. Apu is mocked for his accent and background. The immigrant experience is reduced to dirty water and funny voices. Every time the writers need a punchline, they reach for stereotypes. The Simpsons crossover should have been a celebration. Instead, it reminds us that for Family Guy, racist humor is part of the formula. It doesn't matter if the story is about comics, beer, or chicken fights. Racial stereotypes are sprinkled in as filler, as background noise. They don't drive the story, but they're always there, lurking. That's why The Simpsons Guy earns a place on the list of Family Guy's most racist episodes. Not because it builds a plot around race, but because it shows how normalized racism is in the Family Guy toolbox. Even in a crossover meant to honor animation, the writers couldn't resist turning Springfield into a playground for racist jokes. What's race without class? Family Guy blends both and offends everyone in our next episode. Brief Encounter, S20E5. When Family Guy used class and race as the butt of the joke. On the surface, Brief Encounter looks like a silly episode about Peter and Quagmire swapping underwear. But behind the fart jokes, the story takes another path with Stewie and Doug that reveals something darker. The writers lean on stereotypes about class and class. In American TV, almost always carries racial undertones. The jokes only work because they assume the audience connects lower class with minority communities. The clearest scene comes when Stewie and Doug sit together on the train. Stewie, holding his stuffed toys, tries to talk about his home life. Doug interrupts him with an insult. Out to the land of cheap rents and tract housing, his tone is smug, dismissive, and designed to cut. Doug's world is wealthy, privileged, and detached, while Stewie, though not truly poor, is coded in this moment as someone from the other side. Then Doug notices Stewie's shoelaces. He sneers, "I know about laces, I've just never seen black ones." The gag turns something as simple as shoelaces into a coded jab. The focus on black isn't accidental, the show is layering in racial wording under the cover of class humor. The laugh here is cheap. It depends on the viewer linking blackness with something odd, out of place, or wrong. But the real punchline of the train ride lands when Doug says, "I know little of lower middle class plight." This line stops the conversation cold. He doesn't say poverty, he doesn't say struggles, he says plight, a word usually reserved for documentaries or news reports about people far away. The writers make Doug sound so detached that he treats hardship as a theory, not a reality. And in the United States, when shows talk about lower class plight, the tropes that fills in the blank is usually racial. Black and Latino communities, especially in cities, are the face of that plight. So the line lands as a racial joke without needing to say race out loud. Family Guy has a history of doing this. Instead of making an overt racist statement, the show uses proxies class, accents, cheap housing, bad schools. By keeping the language vague, the writers can deny the racism while still delivering it to the audience that gets the code. Brief Encounter continues that trend. Later in the episode, Doug's elitism grows. When Stewie opens up about the chaos between his toys, Doug barely listens. His face shows boredom until Stewie finishes, then he casually drops his solution. Think about it. Two fellas meet on a train and do each other's murders. The parody of strangers on a train is the joke on the surface. But what sticks is Doug's cold dismissal of Stewie's feelings, echoing how privileged groups often ignore the struggles of those beneath them. This dynamic is played for laughs, but the setup is racialized through the earlier language about class. The show tries to disguise these racial cues in toy-based humor. Doug compares his stuffed cat, Miss Tiggywinkles, to Stewie's monkey, Chi-Chi. On paper, it looks harmless. But again, the choice of Chi-Chi isn't random. That name has been used in American pop culture as a mocking way to signal something foreign, exotic, or non-white. When Stewie says the name with such intensity, the writers know the audience will read it as funny because it sounds ethnic, pairing Doug's refined, English-sounding Miss Tiggywinkles with Chi-Chi creates a racialized contrast between class and culture, hidden under the mask of toys. And then comes the cruelest moment. When Doug catches Stewie about to harm his cat, his angry outburst begins with, "Get away from me, nah," before cutting himself off. The gag is meant to shock, to make the viewer laugh at the near slip, but it works only because the audience hears what word he almost said. The writers are fully aware of the effect. They put the racial slur in Doug's mouth, then pull back just enough to claim innocence. It's one of the laziest tricks in comedy, using racism for shock value while pretending not to. When you put all these moments together, Brief Encounter isn't really about underwear swaps or toy rivalries. It's about taking easy shots at class and race. Doug is written as the perfect vessel, rich, privileged, smug, and casually racist. Stewie, the main victim of his comments, becomes the stand-in for people viewed as less than in society. The jokes don't name race directly, but the coding is there in every insult, every sneer, every plight, and every chi-chi. That's how Family Guy often delivers racism, not always through blatant slurs, but through the sly layering of stereotypes under jokes about class, wealth, or culture. The audience is expected to laugh because they recognize the racial undertones, and that's what makes Brief Encounter one of the most quietly racist episodes in the series. If you're enjoying this series, make sure to like and subscribe. In the next episode, Family Guy pokes a good jab at the Germans. Extra large medium, S8E12, when Family Guy used racist stereotypes as throwaway gags. At first glance, Extra large medium looks like a harmless episode. Chris has a crush, Stewie gets lost, and Peter thinks he's psychic. But in between these storylines, the writers drop in a series of racist cutaways and one-liners that use entire ethnic groups as quick, cheap punchlines. The first big moment comes when Stewie and Chris are lost in the woods. Frustrated with America's lack of education, Stewie suddenly rants, "This is why the other countries are beating us, you know. So you've got only yourself to blame next time you go to the vet and complain that that Indian doctor is too rough with your cat." The joke lands on two stereotypes at once. First, the lazy jab that veterinarians in America are Indian, a recycled gag in sitcoms about foreign doctors. Second, the phrase "too rough with your cat" plays on the idea that immigrant doctors are unskilled or uncaring. It's meant to get a laugh from discomfort, but the setup is built entirely on prejudice. Later, after Chris and Stewie are rescued, the local news plays a short segment celebrating the find. The cutaway then shifts to two German villagers cheering. "Oh, for definite, it's just like a childhood game of hide and find. You said it, friend. What do you say we go dunk our whistles in the trough?" It's over the top, exaggerated accents with stiff phrases that reduce Germans to silly caricatures. The show goes further with jokes about phone cards and holidays, making the characters sound outdated and foreign. The gag doesn't build on character or story, it's simply, look at how funny Germans talk. Another scene takes aim at Italians. After Chris tells Stewie about his crush, Stewie pushes him to be confident. The episode then cuts to a random Italian man saying, "If that was me, I'm just saying, if that was me, they are lucky that was not me. Because if the circumstances were such as you have described them but with me in them, that's a very different and scary outcome for those involved." If. The joke is that Italian men are long-winded, hot-tempered, and always making threats. Instead of a real punchline, the humor leans on a caricature of Italian speech and bravado. The harshest gag comes during Peter's psychic act. On stage, he scans the audience and shouts, "I'm sensing a black guy over here. Is there a black guy?" A man stands up and says, "Me, I'm a black guy." The audience gasps and applauds as if Peter performed a miracle. The entire joke reduces black identity to a spectacle as though simply pointing out someone's race is enough for comedy. The applause is the punchline, making the man's skin color into the trick. The episode doubles down with another moment in the same scene. Peter calls out to a doctor in the crowd, then claims to be channeling the ghost of Lou Costello. When asked the name of the missing victim, Peter is told, he's an Asian fellow, Melvin Who. What follows is an extended routine of who's on first, but played as Who for the Asian surname. What's the name of the guy? Who? The guy who's buried? Who? Matter good Tim. The guy with the bomb? Who? The joke drags on, with the characters repeating who again and again until the bomb explodes. Instead of wit, the gag relies on mocking an Asian name and treating it as nonsense. When you look at extra large medium as a whole, these gags don't connect to the main story. They aren't about Chris's crush, Stewie's rescue, or Peter's fake powers. They're background filler, lazy shortcuts, where stereotypes about Indians, Germans, Italians, black people, and Asians are turned into jokes. That's why this episode earns a spot in the most racist pile. Not because it's built around racism as a theme, but because it sprinkles in racist gags like seasoning, normalizing prejudice as casual humor. For Family Guy, that was often the default punchline. In the next episode, the family goes on the road, driving through the country as they go after Republicans and rednecks. Bend or Blockbuster, S21E2. When Family Guy used road trip comedy to sneak in racist jabs. On the surface, Bend or Blockbuster plays like a light-hearted nostalgia trip. The Griffins pile into their car, head west across America, and chase after the last blockbuster on Earth. It's a classic family road trip setup, quirky pit stops, random chaos, and pop culture riffs. But buried inside the laughter, the show once again dips into its oldest habit, using racism as a throwaway punchline. The most obvious example comes when the Griffins stop for food in the middle of their trip. Lois tries to order like any normal traveler, but the tone shifts the second the locals hear they're from the Northeast. Suddenly, the diner explodes into a chaotic chant. Trump, Trump, Trump. The whole room squawks the name like parrots, painting rural diners as mindless, hostile mobs. It's a caricature of Middle America, reducing an entire community to one note: violent nationalism. The joke is quick, but the image sticks: Northeasterners versus the other America, where difference means danger. A little later, the show uses radio static to land another jab. As the Griffins drive deeper into unknown territory, Peter tunes the dial and lands on: "You're listening to GUNS, AM radio. All guns all the time. Is the caller there?" 3. Rapid gunshots. Haha, I couldn't agree more. The gag paints rural America again, this time as places where even talk radio is just gunfire. It's not subtle. The humor turns small-town life into a parody of violence, suggesting that guns define entire regions of the country. But the sharper racial sting comes later, tucked inside a quiet line that's easy to miss. After the Blockbuster employees corner the Griffins, Peter mocks Lois by saying, "Oh, look who's already walking back their defund the police stance." Little different when it's real life and not trying to impress Alyssa Milano on Twitter, On the surface, it's a jab at Lois, but the joke leans on a deeper racial issue. By reducing the defund the police movement to a Twitter trend, the writers sidestep the serious conversations about race and policing that sparked those protests in the first place. The line treats those issues, police brutality, systemic racism, as disposable, something to mock rather than engage with. Even smaller gags echo this theme. When the family enters the diner, the crowd's shift into Trump chanting isn't just about politics, it carries the undertone of who's welcome and who isn't. The Griffins' Northeastern identity becomes a stand-in for outsiders, a coded way of suggesting that strangers, especially those who don't look or sound like the locals, aren't safe. And later, when Amazon drones swoop in to save the family, one of them says, "Yes, I agree. Amazon workers should not unionize." It's played for laughs, but it also ties into a racial undertone because union busting in America often affects minority and immigrant workers the hardest. Again, the real-world consequences of exploitation get brushed aside as a gag. What makes Bend or Blockbuster stand out isn't that racism is the central theme. It isn't. The story is about nostalgia, family bonding, and old VHS tapes. But racism sneaks in through the cutaways and side jokes, chants, stereotypes, dismissive one-liners. They don't push the story forward. They're just there to get a cheap laugh at the expense of entire groups of people. And that's the problem. Like so many episodes before it, the racism in Bend or Blockbuster doesn't announce itself in the main plot. Instead, it hides in the margins, slipped in between hot air balloon rides and Domino's pizza jokes. It normalizes prejudice by making it casual, by framing it as background humor. That's why this episode earns a place in the lineup, not because it's a racist storyline, but because it shows how racism in Family Guy often operates. Quick, careless, and brushed off as just another laugh. If you've ever argued who invented rock music, whether black or white, Family Guy knows the truth, but they don't care. They have jokes you won't love. Rock Hard, S20E2. When Family Guy mocked black music history with racist caricatures. Rock Hard is supposed to be Family Guy's playful spin on rock legends. Peter and his friends gather in a record store, trading tall tales about music icons. Each character gets to narrate a rock and roll origin story: Jim Morrison, Muddy Waters, Elton John. On the surface, it looks like harmless parody, the kind of sketch-style storytelling Family Guy is known for. But the episode slips into dangerous territory when it tackles the story of Muddy Waters, a pioneer of blues and rock. Instead of celebrating his influence, the show leans into racist stereotypes, turning a cultural legacy into a string of cruel jokes. The setup is simple. Peter insists that white musicians created rock and roll. Jerome, the only black man in the group, pushes back and points out that the genre was born in the Mississippi Delta. He decides to educate them by telling the story of Muddy Waters. At first, this sounds promising, a chance to highlight the erasure of black musicians in music history. But the show doesn't honor that story. Instead, the entire sequence becomes a parade of mocking images. We see Muddy as a child, living so poor that his family literally resides under the Mississippi River. The joke is exaggerated poverty, not just hardship, but absurd destitution. Then comes a gag about the family sharing a single mustache, passed from one relative to the next. Rather than exploring real struggles faced by black families in the South, the scene turns them into a cartoon of deprivation. The laughter comes not from empathy, but from ridicule. The stereotypes keep piling on. A narrator explains that, in those days, black people had nothing, but they still had to wear suits everywhere. The image is muddy, dirt poor, yet straining to keep up appearances in a full suit. The joke plays on the idea that black performers cared more about image than survival. It strips dignity away, turning an important cultural detail into a punchline. Then comes the famous blues myth, the musician at the crossroads making a deal with the devil. In real folklore, this is a story about sacrifice and the supernatural weight of artistry. But Family Guy pushes it into slapstick. The devil casually offers Muddy guitar lessons, and the scene turns into a farce. What should be a symbol of myth and power becomes another chance to laugh at a caricature of black ambition. The most openly racist moment arrives when Muddy begins touring. The record company assigns him an Italian-American driver, supposedly so he can get used to hearing all the worst racial slurs before facing audiences in the South. The line is delivered casually, but the implication is sharp. Racism is just preparation, part of the job. Instead of critiquing that reality, the gag shrugs it off as comedy. Their journey together brings another scene, this time at a carnival. When Muddy tries to enter, a guard shouts that it's a whites-only carnival. It's a clear reference to segregation, a brutal truth of American history, but the show treats it like a quick gag. The Italian driver protests, loudly declaring Muddy's humanity. Within seconds, the conflict disappears, tied up with a neat bow of friendship that transcends race. The weight of segregation, humiliation, and danger gets reduced to a 15-second joke. The sequence ends with a cruel twist. Muddy discovers his songs stolen, the thief revealed as Elvis Presley. The episode frames this theft as a joke, Elvis scribbling down Muddy's lyrics, running off with them, and leaving the bluesman behind. The reality of cultural appropriation, of black musicians denied credit and profit for their work, is treated not as tragedy but as slapstick betrayal. Muddy tries to reach a stool for a timeless black musician photo before the sepia filter ends his story, but he fails, collapsing in another joke at his expense. When all is said and done, Elvis is celebrated, Muddy is erased, and the audience is left with the message that black artists are comic figures in their own history. What makes this sequence so troubling is how casually it plays with real pain. The poverty, the discrimination, the cultural theft. These are not abstract ideas. They are chapters in American history that shaped music, art, and identity. But Family Guy doesn't give them weight. Instead, the show mines them for laughs, reinforcing stereotypes about black poverty, black speech, black ambition, and black disposability. And that's why Rock Hard earns a place among the most racist Family Guy episodes. It doesn't just make one offensive joke in passing, it builds an entire segment on mocking caricatures of black culture. It treats music history not as a chance to shine light on forgotten voices, but as a playground for stereotypes. When viewers laugh at Muddy's family sharing a mustache, or his driver rehearsing racial slurs, or Elvis stealing his songs, the humor is bought at the expense of dignity. The sequence reminds us how often black creators were erased, but instead of honoring them, it repeats the erasure through mockery. Rock Hard could have been an episode about acknowledging overlooked pioneers. Instead, it turned that history into a cruel skit, where racism is just another background joke. If you have enjoyed this analysis of racist Family Guy episodes, subscribe to the channel and click the notification button for future episodes.